This is the first lecture for topic 11, which focuses on chapter 8, which is about voting and political participation. In this lecture, we're going to be taking a look at different types of political participation. The first is we'll look at the types of political participation that fall in the traditional category. One of the traditional forms of political participation is voting. And so in this lecture, we're going to look at restrictions and reforms on voting. And in the next lecture, we're going to take a look at voter turnout and ways in which we've tried to make voting more convenient. Then we're going to look at a non-traditional form of political participation, which your textbook calls digital political participation. Although, since so many people participate in digital political participation, it's becoming a much more mainstream form of participation. And so the categories of traditional and non-traditional aren't as meaningful as they were maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And then we're going to take a look at the benefits and the drawbacks associated with digital political participation. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're just coming out of an election season, the presidential election of 2020. And for many of you, given the age of the folks in the class, I know some of you are older, but some of you are just kind of coming to political age. This might have been the first time that you've had the opportunity to vote in a federal election. And so just take a couple of seconds here, maybe just you can even put the lecture on pause if you want. And you can sort of think about when it comes to participating in politics, how have you participated in politics? Voting is obviously one major way, but there are other ways too. So just pause for a second, take a moment, and think about hey, when it comes to politics, how have I actually tried to get involved? And then we'll come back together. All right, welcome back. So, did you vote in the 2020 election? Yes or no? If you did vote, why? Maybe start thinking about that because your textbook talks about why people vote for the candidates that they do. And if you didn't participate, if you did not vote in 2020, why was that? Our discussion for this week is going to be taking a look at whether or not we need to have a multi-party system. And a lot of times people, when they say why they don't vote, the reason they don't vote is because they don't feel like there's a candidate that actually aligns with what their political beliefs are, because we only have two parties, particularly at the federal level, where either of the two candidates, those two parties, the candidates have a chance for winning. Third party candidates at the federal level don't usually have a chance for winning. And a lot of times people don't participate in voting because of that. Um, we started this semester taking a look at, or earlier this semester, taking a look at reparations and how the protests around Black Lives Matters seems sort of different this time, if you remember that discussion we had earlier in the semester. And so you're living through a time of heightened political activities outside of voting. And so have you participated in a protest, a peaceful protest, a peaceful march? Was it Black Lives Matter, or was it another kind of march? Have you Did you attend a rally that was associated with the campaigning that was going on for 2020? We had two political candidates who took very different approaches to in-person rallying. President Trump continued to hold his in-person rallies, garnering some criticism given the fact that we're at the height of the coronavirus pandemic. And President-elect Joe Biden took a very different approach as a candidate. He really reduced the number of in-person rallies that he held, and the ones that he held were held in like drive-in format. But even so there were a lot less rallies that you could have attended. But did you attend one? Have you donated money to a candidate? It becomes a lot easier to do that with the internet. Back in the day, you had to get out your checkbook and you had to find a stamp. It's a lot easier today with just clicking and donating. Um, did you campaign for either of the presidential candidates, or any of the other candidates who are running in the most recent election? And are there any other ways that you think about in terms of the ways that you may have participated that aren't on this list but that are mentioned in the textbook? So based on how you take the moment and kind of thought about ways in which you participate, maybe match up your own level of political participation with the graph that's from your textbook. Obviously, the most popular way of participating politically is voting, and voting in a general election, not the primary. And we're going to be learning about the difference between those two in the next in the next and final topic for the course. We're going to be talking about non-traditional ways of participating in politics. You'll see that the number two way of, or the most popular way of participating is by expressing your support on social media for a campaign or a candidate. And you can just take a look at it where it goes down from there. That if you actually volunteered or work for a campaign, that's a pretty small percentage of people that do that. Very dedicated people. It takes a lot of time and energy. But even with with the pandemic, a lot of the campaigning was going on not in person. There weren't as many people going door to door. So with the pandemic, you might have been more likely to participate in campaigning by just calling people and phone banking from the comfort of your own home. But that just shows you a breakdown of how other Americans participate, and you can compare it to how you have politically participated. So, traditional participation in politics includes not only voting, but also other forms of participation as well. It can include campaign contributions, volunteering on a campaign, whether that's going door to door to persuade people to vote for your candidate, to phone bank, trying to persuade people on the phone to vote for your candidate, or it could even be something like the campaign setting up opportunities to register people to vote. Those are all examples of volunteering on a campaign. And there's other types of traditional political participation, examples of that as well. Displaying a campaign sign, a lot of people do that. If even contacting an elected official to talk to them about a problem that you might be having and asking them to do something about it, that's a form of political participation. Even sort of challenging a law in court. I mean, that is a form of political participation, not one that most of us engage in, but it still falls in that category of traditional political participation. Protests, peaceful protests and marches, demonstrations, strikes. That, as your textbook points out, that's an age-old form of participatory politics. Those kinds of activities have been going on since the birth of the United States. And in fact, as your textbook points out, that because who could vote, there were many restrictions on who could vote in the United States for quite some period of time. People oftentimes protest because they didn't have other ways of participating. So it's an age-old type of political participation. So here are some pictures of some recent protests that have taken place in the United States, going from left to right. Your textbook talks about the day after the President Trump was inaugurated. There was one of the biggest rallies in the Capitol. It was the Women's March. It's basically women feeling that Donald Trump didn't stand up for women's rights or was not respectful to women, and there was a huge protest. Of course, in the middle, we see NFL players kneeling during the national anthem to protest police brutality. The kneeling is really a part and parcel of the Black Lives Matters movement, and that kneeling, at least initially, was quite controversial, although we see more support for that kneeling as we see an increase in police brutality recently. And on the right, that those are the white nationalists in Charlottesville, Virginia. They were protesting the removal of the Confederate statue in that town, and it was met with counter protests that ultimately led to a violent outcome. And so one of the advantages of protest is that they're very visible, and they oftentimes get a lot of media coverage. And so through that media coverage, that protesters can raise awareness about an issue in a way that they're not able to do in another way, attract like-minded individuals to participate. And I know that when we had our discussion earlier in the semester, a lot of people said that because there were so many protests going on and they knew that friends were protesting for the Black Lives Matter movement, that people joined in. And so that's one of the features of the political sort of persuasive tactics of protests. Now, make sure to read the article that we're reading this week, What Protests Can and Cannot Do. That article looks at the different ways that protests can actually make political change. And so make sure you read it because it shows the work that political scientists have been doing on the issue of protests and whether or not they're politically effective. They ask questions of, do these protests raise awareness about an issue? So like after the protest, do more people know about the issue than they did before? Do protests have a change in public opinion? The article that we read indicated that over the summer that not only did the Black Lives Matter movements raise awareness about an issue, but people's attitudes started changing about racism as well. They also talk about, do changes come as a result, either institutional changes or policy changes. And then finally, that article talks about whether there are electoral consequences from the protests. That is, that the protests might lead to somebody not getting reelected, or there might be a backlash to the protests, and that it might help somebody get elected who is like maybe not likely to be elected. So make sure that you read that article because it's interesting, and there will be a quiz question on it on the reading quiz. The right to vote, also known as suffrage, that's why the women who were seeking the right to vote were called suffragettes. Suffrage means the right to vote. It's a legal right, and for much of the United States history, those who could vote, that there were a lot of restrictions on who could and could not vote. And so, as we're reading our textbook, that voting was initially restricted to property owners. The thinking was that if you owned property, you sort of had a stake in the game, in the political game, because you owned property, you had to pay taxes on it, and so that you were more likely to pay attention to what was going on than those who did not own property. Poll taxes have been used to restrict voting. That the thinking was, well, if you didn't own property, then you'd have to pay something to vote. It was also just used as a mechanism to keep certain groups of people from voting, African Americans and also poor whites. And so poll taxes restricted voting. Literacy tests were designed to stop minorities from voting, and so that that as new voters were brought into the political right to vote, African Americans, that they said, well, before you can actually start voting, you have to demonstrate that you can read. And as we know from your history classes that you've taken, if you took one of those literacy tests, if I didn't teach political science, I'd probably fail it. If I teach it, I would pass it. But the vast majority of people would not be able to pass those literacy tests because it wasn't just to show if you could read, but it asked arcane questions about the Constitution, etc. They were, again, just mechanisms used to stop certain groups of people from voting. So as it said, for a lot of our history, suffrage was not universal, that it was restricted. And states often took the lead role in restricting suffrage. As we'll learn in this chapter and in the next, that states are the ones, the Constitution gives states the powers to hold elections and to place, requirements on who can vote. And because states have those powers, you really have this sort of patchwork of different laws regarding who can and cannot vote. And so, examples that your textbook talks about, that as more immigrants came into the United States, that northern cities passed laws and northern states passed laws limiting immigration from voting in those areas. And after the Civil War and the demise of Reconstruction, that even though we amend our Constitution to prohibit discriminating against African American men when it came to voting, that laws were passed that, like the literacy test, the poll taxes, and other legal forms of making it very difficult for people to vote. And so those Jim Crow voting laws prevented a lot of African Americans in the South from voting. Although there have been historically a lot of restrictions that are placed on voting, and in the next section we're going to take a look at current restrictions that are placed on voting. Even though that's the case, the dominant trend in the United States has been to expand the vote. And so starting after the Civil War, the 15th Amendment is added to the Constitution, and this gives black men the right to vote. Um, in 1920, the 19th Amendment gives women the right to vote. And so with the 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment combined, I see that we're coming closer to universal enfranchisement. But keep in mind that even though African Americans men got the right to vote in 1870, and African American women got the right to vote in 1920, it isn't until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that fully enfranchises African Americans in the United States. Because there were many laws that were placing restrictions like poll taxes, like literary tests, like white primaries, etc., that makes it very difficult for African Americans to vote. And so the Voting Rights Act allows the federal government to challenge those laws that are affecting minority voters. And then in 1971, as a sort of a response to the protests that were going on during the Vietnam War, the 26th Amendment is passed, and it lowers the voting age to 18. So if a state had on its had a law saying that you had to be 21 years or older to vote, that those laws are now unconstitutional with the passage of the 26th Amendment. So it really allows all people who are 18 years and older to have the right to vote. The 26th Amendment, as I said in your textbook, talks about there was a lot of protesting going on during the Vietnam War, and it was sort of destabilizing. And that there was also there was this sense that if you gave younger people a way of politically being able to communicate, to make a difference at the ballot box, that might tamp down some of the political protests that were going on. And so that's sort of an overview of the expansions on voting that have taken place within the last 100 plus years. Okay, so what about the so-called non-traditional ways of participating politically, also known as digital political participation, although these are very mainstream. A lot of people participate in these today. And so digital political participation are these activities that are designed to influence politics using the internet. And these include things such as visiting a candidate's website. And so candidates are very internet savvy these days. They have Facebook pages, they have websites, they use social media such as Twitter to communicate their message. And so not only are they participating digitally, but voters do too by visiting candidate websites. That oftentimes social media and just the websites in general will organize events online. And so that not for an online event, but that you learn about an event because it is advertised on Facebook or it's advertised in on Twitter. And so events are organized using an online platform that you may be asked to sign an online petition that would then be sent to a candidate or an elected official. I don't know how. I think there's evidence to say that those online petitions are not that persuasive, but still, this is the way people signing that is a form of political participation, whether or not it is an effective form. And that, people use social media to express their support for a particular political issue or a particular candidate. And so a lot of young people supported Bernie Sanders, both in the 2016 campaign cycle and also in the 2020 campaign cycle. And, I remember from my, news feeds on Facebook and on Twitter, people would change their profile picture to have like a bird because like a bird landed on on his podium. The example they use in the textbook is using the hashtag of love wins after the Bergefell decision. And so a lot of people use this digital political participation to express their support. And second to voting, this is the most common way that people are participating in politics recently. There are definitely some benefits to digital political participation. One of the major benefits is that the research shows that people who digitally participate are more likely to offline participate, right? Than those who don't digitally participate. And so people who learn about candidates online, visit websites online, hashtags, follow people on Twitter and Facebook, they're more likely to vote. They're more likely to actually do in-person campaign volunteering. They're more likely to attend a meeting. In fact, you kind of find out about meetings sometimes online that you wouldn't otherwise have known about. And it also makes discussing politics with family and friends less taboo. And so all of those are seen as sort of benefits of the digital political participation because it serves as a gateway to more traditional forms of participation. The political scientists look at that and ask, like, why is that? And a lot of it seems sort of, a little bit obvious. I mean, for one, when you're using a digital platform, it's really easy to get access to information, right? You're looking at it 24/7, and you're going to see things that you wouldn't like otherwise see, like a poster that is, plastered on like a business that you go to or like a cafe that you go to. Well, oh, I heard about a rally because I saw a poster. Well, no, I heard about a rally because I saw it on Facebook, right? And so it's easier to obtain information. There's also accidental mobilization, which I think that's a benefit, but it can also be sort of a detriment. But like you can just be Googling something, and you know that the algorithms know what you are looking at on online, and they sort of tailor your ads accordingly, and so that you get mobilized because you are the algorithms are sort of, sending you political messages that you wouldn't otherwise see. And it just makes participation easier because when you are, you might not have known about a meeting. It's sometimes hard to figure out when a rally is. It's kind of hard to figure out which candidate you want to vote for. But if you're getting that information online, then it's easier to go and actually participate in those events in person. So just as there are benefits, there are some drawbacks to the digital political participation. Much like we saw with in our chapter of media and politics, that when you participate in politics digitally, that you're subject to the same echo chambers and filter bubbles that they talked about in the last chapter. That we filter out people we don't agree with, and that we listen to those voices that we agree with, and that can have the impact of increasing our polarization. And so that when we participate in politics, particularly if we participated in it through the digital medium, we are more likely to get polarized because we are not presented with opposing points of view. We're not learning about how the opposing points of view have some value to them, and that we are just digging our heels in when it comes to our political party or our political candidate. Another downside of the digital political participation is the anonymous aspect of it. We all know that if we are not in a face-to-face environment, there are things that we would never say to other people because we are with them. We're talking to them. They see us as humans, and you see the other person as a human. But in an online forum, people say things that they never would say or would be a lot less likely to say in a face-to-face forum. And that anonymity can lead to forums that can erode and really damage democracy. And so it can lead to people using hate speech, harassing others. It can lead to disruption within the actual public square by targeting groups or women, minorities, others. And it may lead to people opting out of participating in discussing politics because they see it to be such a toxic environment. And so that can have an erosive effect because people are just like, forget about it. I'm not even going to talk politics with others. And also just keep in mind about the way that the digital forum or the digital political participation sets us up to being vulnerable to foreign interference. When we're getting a lot of our information about politics online, then if somebody hacks into that online forum, they can manipulate what we're seeing politically, and we may not be aware of it. And clearly, the most recent example of that was the Russian interference in the 2016 election. Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin, they really, have a stake in creating chaos within the United States, that they benefit from that. And one of the ways that they can create that chaos is to exacerbate political tensions within the body politics. And that's exactly what Russia did in the 2016 election. They posted things on social media that led to mobilizing Trump voters. They posted things that demobilized Clinton supporters. And they promoted third-party candidates like Bernie Sanders. And the reason they did that isn't because they necessarily preferred one candidate over another, but they did that because Russia benefits if there's a lot of disorder, chaos, and lack of trust in our political institutions and our electoral system. They benefit from that, and that's why they did it. And depending on the digital political participation opens us up to that kind of interference, which can be dangerous for democracy. So in conclusion, just some things to think about critically when it comes to political participation, and also to help you make some connections between this chapter and some of the other chapters. When it comes to your political participation, whether or not you campaigned, protest, vote, how did your parents serve as agents of socialization regarding political participation? Did your parents vote? And if so, did they take you to the voting booth and make it like a big deal and sort of communicate to you the importance of voting? Did you ever see your parents campaigning or donating money? And if you didn't, if they didn't do those things, maybe think about that impact that it's had on whether your willingness to politically participate. And also thinking about the benefits and the drawbacks or the potential harms of digital participation. Do you feel that the benefits of digital participation outweigh the potential harms? Okay, thanks a lot for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.